So I want to talk about where I see the media heading from here and how each of you can take advantage of these trends for your crowdfunding campaign. The first is that media publications have struggled in the past, and I predict will continue to struggle. And it's very important because we're going to continue to see the rise of these new publications. And in addition to that, we're going to see media will continue to fragment. So historically, 20 years ago, PR was about contacting journalists at the New York Times, at Wall Street Journal, etc. About 15 years ago, that changed. It became about contacting journalists and bloggers at TechCrunch, etc. And I predict going forward, it's going to be about contacting journalists, bloggers, and gatekeepers. So you're going to be just as likely to contact somebody on YouTube who's very popular, or someone on Snapchat, as you would a traditional journalist. And the reason why that's very important is PR is effective because many of these publications and platforms have enormous audiences. And in order to raise as much funding as possible for your crowdfunding campaign, you really should present your message to the largest audience that you can. And where audiences spend their time is continually going to change, so it's something to keep in mind. The other point to keep in mind is publications and media are increasingly going to be looking for individuals to contribute content to. So as I mentioned before with these guest articles and thought leadership pieces, publications like Forbes are very aggressive. You're starting to see publications such as Entre Magazine ask people to submit videos of themselves, etc. And this provides a great opportunity for people to create free content and get that return on investment. PR, in many ways, is beyond just, it's going to expand beyond just media into greater communication. So in many ways, the strategy that I told you to get media coverage, it's actually very similar to the strategy I recommend people use to raising funding and to communicating to partners in your team about kind of amplifying the mission and raising funding. I think it's so important. I mentioned before, I've raised funding for 4 companies, and the emails I sent to investors, they are very similar to the emails I would send if I was contacting the New York Times as well. The last thing I want to mention is if you are interested in going from internet famous to mainstream, sometimes people ask about this, I would recommend focusing on images and video. These tend to be much more powerful mediums than text. So in terms of takeaways for your crowdfunding campaign, it's important to keep in mind the media is not the only, PR is not the only marketing channel you can use, but it tends to be a very effective one, and it's free as well for each of you to use. You don't necessarily need these prior connections to be featured on these publications. Again, I've seen hundreds and hundreds of data points of people who have never met anyone from the New York Times being featured on there just because they use this process, the famous acronym that I mentioned to you before. And I really encourage you to get started. I know a lot of people tend to be afraid to contacting the media. I included the email template earlier that each of you can follow.